Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. So yeah, I just want to say thanks to the Global Studies Association for inviting me, and thank you all for coming out on a Sunday, which I know is a hard day to come to presentations. And I also want to thank Elizabeth Costa for helping, sort of pull this together. So I'm thankful. So I'll just say a quick bit about me, and then I can jump in. So I'm a faculty member at Rutgers University. I am, as Bill mentioned, I'm an anthropologist by training, and situated though in the media studies department. And my research has traditionally focused on the intersection of technology and social movements and inequality. And currently I'm working on projects around gig workers. And alongside my research, I am a community organizer and labor organizer. And I founded a group helped found a group based in Philadelphia called Media Mobilizing Project, now renamed Movement Alliance Project, which we started that in 2005, which really tried to figure out how to use the technologies that were emerging at the moment to build the power of plural working folks across the city of Philadelphia. And that connects to some of the stuff we'll talk about today. Alongside that, I recently co-founded a center, which is a collaboration between Rutgers and University of Pennsylvania, which is also located in Philly, which is where I am, called the Mike Center, and it's focused on media inequality and change. And then the last thing I'll say about myself is my last 2 years have been consumed. I'm the president of the faculty grad adjunct postdoc union at Rutgers, and my life has been consumed with fighting around higher ed austerity. So my brain is it's somewhere away from my research for the last year, so I apologize for that. But there's many important higher ed questions that converge with some of the stuff we'll talk about today. So with respect to what we'll talk about today, what I want to say is it's a work in progress, and it's something I've been working on in collaboration with a political scientist at University of South Florida, Peter Funke, for a while. And so there's some really important stuff here, but I really want to hear from folks and try to build this out more and get thoughts. And I can't go into a talk without making a caveat that I have 3 kids running around the house today and on the internet at ages of 9, 7, and 5. So I don't know what's going to happen. And also both, they may attack at any moment, A, and then B, my internet can get a little bit dodgy in certain moments. So I just want to make that caveat. So what I'm going to talk about today, I titled this From Global Justice to Occupy Podemos and BLM, Mapping Stages of Contemporary Activism. And this project, as I said, it's a work in progress, and the goal is to begin to understand the broad outlines of a logic of resistance from the 1990s to present. And I'll get to that in a moment. But one note I want to add is that much of this research was done before the pandemic and before the murder of George Floyd, and a set of associated crises that we're living in at the moment. So it doesn't fully attenuate the last 2 years of movement-based resistance, and there are real important questions about those, like BLM and how it's emerged and developed over the last 2 years versus the first wave of BLM, but also how communities in the US and across the world have responded to the pandemic. Also, it's Sunday. It feels oppressive speaking at you for 30 minutes on a Sunday. So everyone's exhausted by Zoom. I know that I am. It's the end of a pandemic, we hope. So I'll try to keep my comments I'll try to end them at 25 minutes and aim for back and forth. So with that though, I'm going to work through some of this work we have. So I'm going to start. So let me start here. Towards the end of 2010, Egyptian internet activist and Google executive Wael Ghonim created the Facebook page We Are All Khaled Saeed to document the murder of a young Egyptian computer programmer, Khaled Saeed, at the hands of plainclothes police. Within days of establishing the Facebook group, thousands of Egyptians joined to express their grief and rage over Saeed's death. Some weeks later, Ghonim used that Facebook page to initiate, from his vantage, initiate a call for Egyptians to occupy Tahir Square and demand true democracy. And he did that. The day he called for this to happen was January 25th, which was purposefully national and still is National Police Day in Egypt. And so Ghanim's call merged with a bunch of other calls that had been made and was successful. And the Egyptian uprising began in earnest on January 25th, when thousands went to the square for the initial protest. During that uprising, which we all know much better now, during that uprising, the police kidnapped and interrogated Ghanim for 11 days. He was held in captive. And he was eventually released, and he, and along with all of Egypt and the world, was witness to what at the moment was an awe-inspiring revolution for the young 21st century, ultimately one that we all feel frustrated by in certain ways, but still awe-inspiring at the moment. And that it wasn't the beginning, right? It started first in Tunisia some months earlier and spread across North Africa and the Middle East, and then moved from North Africa and the Middle East to Europe, the US, Asia, South America, and other parts of the world. So we all know that history now. But after the initial wave of contention subsided, Ghanim reflected on the role of technology and strategy in the Egyptian uprising in North Africa. And Ghanim wrote a book and argued that from his vantage, we were witnessing the outlines of what he called Revolution 2.0. He looked back at the struggles across the 20th century, and he said there was an old model, Revolution 1.0, which was carried out by charismatic leaders and political parties and utilized conventional political strategies. In converse, through the window of the North African uprisings and European anti-austerity protests, as well as Occupy, Ghanim contended that we have seen the outlines of a new strategy. In this model, revolutions, and these are important points, revolutions are leaderless, non-hierarchical, networked, improvisational, with multiple groups and strategies playing roles. The revolution in Egypt, and more importantly, the analysis by Ghanim and others, so it's not just Ghanim, I mean, importantly, Manuel Castells made similar arguments to this, and I have disagreements, which we'll get to, but the reason I'm marking it is it offers a starting point for us to analyze social movements in the current political moment. And particularly what I want to assert that we have seen, so I'm in agreement that we have seen a new movement logic in a contemporary wave of struggle, or what he calls Ghanim Revolution 2.0. But the roots aren't in Tunisia or Egypt, but actually emerged decades earlier. And one thing that he misses, as well as Castells in this case, is they're not simply in relationship to the emergence of the internet, but actually you see the roots of this in the 90s, and I'll say more about that. And you see a deep relationship between these movements and the rise of neoliberal capitalism. And so here's a point of departure for me from Ghanim and Castells. One, that this history goes back to the 90s, and two, that capitalism is very important in understanding how this emerged. And so the point to Ghanim is that he, of course, and that's not surprising, missed the world political economy here. So what I want to do, given that opening statement, what I want to do today is make three arguments. First, I'm going to argue that across the globe, we've seen the emergence of a new epoch of struggle defined by a particular movement logic or set of characteristics that's shared by movements and groups. And this new epoch is in conversation with older forms of movement politics. And here I'm going to shorthand it, the old left and the new left, and tied to shifting dynamics of capitalism, as well as the transformation of communication technologies. And what I'll argue, and I'll do this in some detail, is that this logic emerged actually with the Zapatistas, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation in the early 90s, and the ensuing global justice movement. And so with that, what I'm going to argue is that basically what we're seeing, or what we've seen, is one large kind of period of contention that goes from the 90s to present, with two particular waves. One wave we could call the spring wave, starting in 2010 with the uprisings in North Africa and the Middle East, and then the anti-austerity protests in Europe Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, the umbrella movement, etc. But then there's an earlier wave, which I call the global justice wave, which starts with the Zapatistas and moves through the global justice movement, including projects like the Indie Media Initiative and the World Social Forum process. And while these two waves, global justice on one hand and the spring wave on the other, are distinct, what I would argue is that they're linked together by a larger kind of logic of how movements operate. So alongside making that argument, I'm going to detail what the core characteristics or the meta logic is that connects all of these movements together. And I'm going to outline them here, and I'll go into it slightly more detail down the road. First, and we know these things, first is the use of social media by participants. The second is the desire for implementing horizontal, leaderless, and prefigurative forms of organizing. The third is the embrace of diversity and equality of agents of struggle, which is often against, say, the old left. The fourth is decision-making process based in grassroots democracy and consensus decision-making. And the fifth is a general distrust of established actors such as parties or unions, as well as existing political institutions. And there, I think over the last couple of years, we've seen some shifts, but still, it's still a defining characteristic. Third, and building on this analysis, I'm going to lay out just some concerns, some strengths and some concerns about what's emerged. So I'm going to just take a drink of water. In order to understand this current epoch or this broad historical sweep I'm trying to make an argument for, it's critical to just briefly, and maybe in Q&A we can go into more details because I don't have much time for it here, mark like a history that I'm building on here. So PACE historians, I argue that, and this is, I want to admit, somewhat US centric, but that said, the PACE historians, I'm going to argue that in the 20th century, we saw and we've characterized two major epochs of social movement-based resistance. The first period has been characterized by many scholars as the old left. There's a lot of writing on it, from the early 20th century to the end of World War II, influenced heavily by Marxism, principally focused on trade unionism, the development of political parties, and the central antagonism between capital and labor. And that movement heavily influenced the rise of the civil rights movement. And in turn, the civil rights movement heavily influenced the next period, which is known again by historians and argued as post-war period of the New Left, which challenged the central role of class, articulating, and we know this history, but articulating a host of concerns from civil rights and gender equality to ending the Vietnam War and US imperialism. And the New Left in turn led to the birth and growth of the environmental movement, as well as gay rights movements and the later stages of the feminist movement. So this is a kind of quick and dirty, and there's a lot more here, and we could talk about the problems with periods, but also the strengths of periodizing movements. But maybe we can do that in Q&A. But following these two broad stages, what I'm suggesting from the 90s forward is we've entered a new kind of stage. And this stage is deeply imprinted by neoliberal capitalism, deeply impacted by the rise of the internet, but also the changing role of the nation state. And this new moment is characterized by a meta-logic that takes the shape of a globalized, digitized, radically democratic networked kind of movement formation. So it's this third epoch that I want to address today. At some points in the past, we've called it the cyber left. I think that's very problematic. I called it that, not others. And I don't think that's the right term now, so I'm not going to use it. I don't have one to kind of offer to understand this period or to give a name to it yet. And as I said, in this period that we're in, we're heuristically dividing it into two waves, the global justice wave from the 90s to the 2000s, and the spring wave from 2010 to present. And research has shown a lot of it on the global justice wave that diminished in the 2000s before the economic crisis of 2008. And this new cycle of protest emerged post the economic crisis of 2008. finding its expression in what we're calling the Spring Wave, which starts with the Arab uprisings, the anti-austerity movements from 15M in Spain, or Indignados, to Greece, to Occupy type protests in the campus in New York, Frankfurt, and Hong Kong, to Black Lives Matter, and more recently developments in Southern Europe, etc. So in order to kind of make this argument and trying to be kind of thoughtful about time, I do think it's important to discuss the roots of it, because they are largely left out of a discussion in understanding protests today. So people could find a lot of roots, and I think there was a lot of things that were going on in the 90s, but for me, the focal root to understand this moment we're in is the Zapatista uprising in southern Mexico, which took place on January 1st, 1994, the day the North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect. The Zapatistas, and many know this, but just it's important to remark, were largely Mayan, largely farmers, and they rose up because they saw their ability to make a living being destroyed by the North American Free Trade Agreement. And they famously released, before they, or as they rose up, a communique where they said, basta, enough. And in this communique, which was widely shared, the Zapatistas claimed that the NAFTA was a death sentence to the way of life of indigenous farmers in Mexico. So I'm not going to go into detail on the struggle in Chiapas, but it's important to note a few things. So the EZLN rose up. They rose up in a very traditional fashion. They all covered their faces with black balaclavas. They had Uzis, and they took over the capital of Chiapas. They took over most of the towns in the state of Chiapas, which is the southernmost state of Mexico. And they also took over radio stations, which flags their enduring love of the media. And that led to a protracted battle with the Mexican state. And while the Zapatistas had 12,000 people in their army, they were overmatched by the weapons of the Mexican military and the US supported military, importantly. And the Zapatistas, after taking over this part of Chiapas, quickly beat a retreat into the mountains of southern Mexico. And the Mexican army pursued the Zapatistas with the intent of wiping the resistance out. And it's at this moment, with some bloodshed in Chiapas and an effective kind of Zapatista communique to the world, which reached a growing network of non-governmental organizations and activists in Mexico and beyond, that people began to support the Zapatistas. And I think across North America, there was massive occupations. I think there was one in Toronto. There's a very big one in DC. There's a big one also in Mexico City, and then also in San Cristobal in Chiapas, the capital. And these encampments or occupations forced the Mexican government to sign a ceasefire with the Zapatistas 12 days after the initial conflict. And as a spokesperson of the Zapatistas, Subcomandante Marcos explained about their uprising, he wrote, "We rose up not to kill or be killed, but so that they would listen to us." And then they go on in true, they're very paradoxical in some of their statements. And so they, in a communique that they put out, the Zapatistas, they say, "We were invisible to you for 500 years, 500 years of looting by the beast, 500 years of two Mexicos, one Mexico which produces wealth, another which appropriates that wealth. But by covering our faces with our balaclavas, we become visible." So they sign an armistice, and there's a discussion about how to move forward. And that goes on for a very long time. And the Mexican foreign minister observes, and this is important to the argument I'm trying to make, that Chiapas, quote, "is a place where there have not been shots fired for 15 months. So this is in 1995. The shots only lasted 10 days, he argues. But ever since the war, since those shots, there's been a war of ink, a war of written word, a war on the internet." So this, I'm arguing, is sort of the root. So Zapatistas began as a very kind of traditional South American military uprising, but they quickly change. So during the ensuing struggle, the Zapatistas overturned much of the received wisdom about social conflict and insurrection. And the shift wasn't lost on the Zapatistas themselves. They wrote in the communique, the theories and organizational strategies of the traditional left are outworn and tarnished robes, they argue. So they rise up, they become this cause celeb in this moment. And throughout academia, and journalists are trying to define them, and commentators give all these monikers to them. And I want to just walk through them because it sort of sets the stage. So one calls them the first postmodern revolutionary movement. Another calls them the first informational guerrilla movement. Another calls them a hinge between the old guerrilla model and a new model of biopolitical network structures. And the last one calls them the new electronic fabric of struggle. And while each of these characterizations portray something different, they all are saying that there's something informational, something networked and electronic going on here. And so ultimately, what we see is this new way of pushing forward movements that's deeply implicated or entwined with in communication technologies. But it's not only that. The EZLN also had a very innovative structure, and they had a very interesting decision-making apparatus across their 12,000 members that was very deeply democratic. And they also had made these calls to all of Mexicans to join them in their uprising. So they really were pushing on this question of who leads, saying that we should all lead together, which is why they wore the masks. So in the years following the struggle in Mexico, this logic, I argue, traveled northward to the US, emerging in a different context to hit the streets of Seattle, where 80,000 demonstrators were mobilizing against the third ministerial meetings of the World Trade Organization in '99. During the Battle of Seattle, protesters directly challenged the power of global capitalism, shutting down the WTO. And this moment led to the birth of the Indie Media Movement, which I wrote my first book on, as well as the emergence of the World Social Forum, which were the movement apparatuses that moved forward the global justice movement throughout the 2000s. And activists involved in the global justice movement were deeply influenced by the Zapatistas. This is important to note, and always reflected back that the Zapatistas were their inspiration, and they built their strategy off the Zapatista strategy. So I won't go into much more there, but I wanted to flag that and note that the strategies of the Zapatistas and the global justice movement in turn had a deep impact on the uprisings of North Africa and the Middle East, as well as the anti-austerity protests of the Indignados and in Greece and the Occupy. And there's many movement actors said that they had learned from and were using the strategies that came out of the Zapatistas and the global justice movement to take on Occupy, for instance. Occupy, in the initial call for Occupy, there's a direct reference to the global justice movement and the shared strategy. And so this brings me to this broad argument I'm making, which is that many scholars are seeing the 2010 to 2020 as a particular movement logic that's emerged. And I'm arguing that no, it's actually 30 years old, and there's these two waves that we need to sort of grapple with. So just to move us forward, I want to mark some of the characteristics so that we can kind of see what are the broad characteristics that link the Zapatistas to movements like Occupy. And these broad characteristics there are 5 of them. The first is an acceptance and embrace of the diversity and equality of all actors and their different struggles. And Black Lives Matter pushes back against this general trend, so we can talk about that. But and this, in general, as a trend, pushes back against the old left and the belief that the proletariat must lead movements, right? The second characteristic is the use of social media, not just to tell one's story, right? But also social media almost becomes the infrastructure that holds together these movements, which is really important to note. Black Lives Matter is in many ways organized by a hashtag. Occupy as well is deeply, and still is deeply, well, not still is, but was deeply connected to its internet strategies. The third is a commitment to a leaderless and prefigurative form of organizing. I'll talk more about that. The fourth is a decision-making process based on consensus decision-making and grassroots democracy. We all know those massive town halls of Occupy, where they were having literally, so in Zuccotti Park, literally thousands of people trying to make decisions about where to put a latrine. And the last one, as I marked, is a distrust in institutional actors. But let me just say a brief bit about each of these in turn, so we kind of are on the same page. So, so one of the core attributes of contemporary organizing is a belief that all forms of struggle are equally important. In this sense, there's no vanguard. And the vision then is that we want to build a network of interconnected struggles where all forms of resistance are equally important. And again, BLM challenges this tendency and importantly centers racism and white supremacy as a core problem, and therefore the leading edge of solving that problem obviously is Black people and in the fight for liberation. So that challenges this, and I don't want to gloss over that. A second characteristic, as I said, is the deep use of technology. This traces back to the Zapatistas clearly. And we see it in almost every movement, the deep kind of connection to social media and the internet more broadly. The third characteristic is prefigurative politics, which emerged out of the New Left and anarchist movements more broadly, but also the Zapatistas. And the concept of prefigurative politics, I won't have time to go into in detail today, but basically the idea is that you create in the movement the practices, structures, and vision that you want to actualize in the world. So you don't have a hierarchical movement that wants to create equality. That's the idea. And so prefiguration or prefigurative politics tends to mean that you don't go into long-term planning and you need to build flat horizontal structures for all your movements. The fourth of the characteristics, as I said, is democratic decision-making or consensus-based decision-making process. And the last one is a distrust, particularly of, on the left, a distrust of parties, a distrust of unions, any sort of hierarchical institution. Now, taken alone, these characteristics can be glossed over, but if you look at them together, it actually offers us the vision of a kind of logic, a logic that movements should be flat and horizontal and democratic. And that logic has become a dominant logic for social movements. Again, not all, but many. And I want to be clear here that I'm not arguing that what we see in the Zapatistas and what we see in the Arab uprisings and or what we see in Occupy are identical. What I'm saying, so in each space and time, you're going to see very different kind of adaptations of these logics. But what I'm saying is that these logics manifest themselves across these times and spaces and places and have become a sort of, I'd say, hegemonic logic of how movements should be organized. So I guess the last thing I've been going on, and the last thing I want to say is that we should understand the strength of these movements, the ability to, if you think about the spring wave or 2010 forward, we've seen massive movements take on and build very quickly and overthrow governments, right? So there's really important aspects to these logics. There's also weaknesses, and we need to be able to like understand these weaknesses. And one of them is a lack of like defined organizational structure that leads to invisible power structures oftentimes, right? So when you don't have a well understood and articulated structure, often certain people are able to fill in and take power. Famously, Joe Freeman called this a tyranny of structurelessness. A second thing about having a lack of kind of organizational structure is, and we saw this in many of the movements, that they're able to move and develop and grow very quickly, and they also dissipate often quite as quickly, right? So a lack of organizational infrastructure often leads to the growth, quick growth, and also quick loss. And when you're fighting, whether it's structural racism or white supremacy or capitalism, not having movements that can endure is a problem. And the last thing I'll just flag is, and this I think we've seen a shift, is the lack of a desire to engage with institutional actors. breeds a sort of romanticism in movements that we can, quote, change the world without taking power, which I think can be problematic. And what we've seen, though, over the last couple of years is a pushback here from everything from Podemos to the engagement with things like the Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn campaign. We've seen an engagement with political parties, and we're also seeing a growth of unions that sort of push back on some of these logics. So I went on long enough. I'm going to stop there and hope we can get into good.